So very finally, we have number 5, and this is edges. So for me, this can be one of the final principles that I really start to focus on with students when they are already composing good paintings. They're getting to grips with values and colour mixing is starting to make sense to some extent, and also their drawing is solid. And I've noticed this is a principle that can really start to take people's painting to the next level. And whilst there's no harm in thinking about edges straight away, the previous kind of principles are vital before we can even start considering edges. I've often said to students that learning to paint is like learning to drive. I.e., when we first start out, we can't even change gear without kind of swerving into the verge or looking down at the gear stick, or trying to balance the clutch whilst we're doing a maneuver is just way too much to think about at once. But as those basics become second nature, we can then start to focus more on the finer details like checking our mirrors and doing hill starts and all of that sort of stuff. And as time goes on, we, in theory, then become more accomplished drivers or more accomplished painters. So essentially, and obviously, we lay the foundational stuff first. We get to grips with that to at least some extent, then we can build up from there. I.e., we're not jumping straight onto the motorway or driving in the middle of a city as soon as we hop in a car for the first time. That would be crazy. So metaphors kind of out of the way. That's not to say that you shouldn't start being aware of what edges are and giving them some consideration straight away, wherever you're at on your painting journey. And actually, simply being aware of what we mean by edges and what to look out for is actually all we really need to do initially. We can then be more conscious and deliberate about them as time goes on. And as always, it doesn't have to be complicated or hard. As I said, just an awareness of them and then purposely varying them can actually be really powerful in a painting, and it can be enough. But what are we actually talking about here? So we can have, very simply, hard, soft, and lost edges. So when considering edges within a single form, they generally are representing how the different planes of an object relate to each other, how the form works, how it's formed. So take a sharp-cornered cube. The edge between one plane and another is very hard, and we can see that in this case with a big change in value that meets at a sharp, hard edge. Now if we start to round off the form a little bit, the edges begin to get softer. Now the softness of that edge can vary greatly, and it can go right up, once we really start softening edges, to something a bit closer to a sphere where the edges are completely soft, i.e. the transition from light to shadow is indeterminate. If we were to completely blend the transition, we may even call it a lost edge. We can't tell where one tonal value exactly becomes another. We can't tell exactly when light becomes shadow. Now we don't always necessarily want to do this in a painting, but this is the concept of edges. The type of edge is also relevant in an object's relationship to another object or its background. So there's lots of factors, but the obvious two main ones to help with edges are tonal values and also the physical use of the medium. So if I take a cube with this side in shadow, this other side slightly less in shadow, and then we put it against a background, if that background is tonally exactly the same, then the edge of the cube here becomes lost. Now, if we change the value of one or the other, even ever so slightly, so that we can kind of now see an edge, at least very slightly, but it's a very soft edge. And then depending on how soft, we would still call it a lost edge or a soft edge of varying degrees. The extent of this principle obviously varies depending on the tonal difference. And of course, we can always have a very hard edge here, for example, but we could also soften it slightly. And we are now beginning to drift into the physicality of whatever medium it is you're using. So with charcoal and oils, we have the option to literally blend the paint wet into wet. And we can go back and do this over quite a reasonably long period of time, especially relative to acrylics and watercolour. Now with acrylics, we can blend wet into wet, but because they dry quicker, some people find this hard, or we may lose the chance to do so. But we can also achieve the illusion of blending by using small increments or stepping stones of tonal value or colour to get from one area to another. The more of these little steps that you have, the softer the transition feels, with larger jumps between tone feeling a bit more painterly. And this is called optical blending, and it's equally usable in the other mediums too. We don't have to blend wet into wet in oils and charcoal, but it's there as an option. And of course with watercolour, we can get soft edges from working wet into wet. The more water on the page and in the brush, the more lost or the softer an edge becomes. Working more damp into damp gives slightly harder edges, but they can have a softness to them. And then in this video here on the watercolour clock, I go into this in much more detail, specifically in relation to watercolour, so I definitely recommend you check that out. The final consideration is then about variation of edges, and again we're going to look at it in the context of a shape and its interaction with its background, and this is really useful. So in very basic terms, our object can essentially interact with its background in four main ways, four different ways that we can see an edge or not see one. So the two easiest and most common ones are either going to be a light against a dark, or a dark against a light, so object against background, light against dark, or dark against light. Essentially a significant and noticeable difference in tonal values between two areas. Then the next two being a far less noticeable contrast, or even completely the same tonal values between object and background. So this would be dark against dark, or shadow against shadow. And this is one that I often like to use to create softness, to create a lack of definition in shadow areas in particular. As we know from previous videos, the shadow areas are lit by the much weaker reflected or ambient light, and therefore they are less described and they are less literal, and therefore they are softer. Then finally, the one that I most regularly miss, or I don't feel I get enough of in my own work, and it's something I'm working on, and this is light against light. So although there's lots of subtle variations depending on what values you actually use, I tend to think about these edges in these simplified extremes. So that's it, 4 types of edge: dark against light, light against dark, light against light, and dark against dark. The classic example of this is the Rembrandt windmill, with 4 different sails doing 4 different types of interaction with the background and the sky. So as I said, this may initially all sound very complicated, but again, simply just knowing that there are different types of edges and they can be used in painting very effectively is a really great start. Try just softening the odd edge here and there to try and counteract and contrast some of the more hard edges. Then we can play around with how often and how much we soften edges. So this playing with lost and found edges creates such great variety and real interest in a painting. It creates different levels of focus throughout a painting, and it can also help the viewer to move around the painting. Our eyes are generally drawn to harder shaped edges or in focus areas, but then these focused areas can really sing out and come to the forefront if we then soften other areas down. And whilst initially we may think we need to separate all the objects in a painting, for example, say a still life, we might feel we have to perfectly separate each object. Actually, we realise it's much more fun when we don't. For example, when we let shadows and different forms drift in and out of each other with a real sense of softness and lost edges, and it actually gives a really strange but very effective sense of realism. There's going to be lots more on edges to come, but those for me are the big 5. That's composition, drawing and draftsmanship. We've got tonal values, colour, and edges. So these 5 I've been aware of and I'm constantly trying to improve on, whatever my subject. Now last year sometime I then saw a wonderful artist, Casey Bow, talk about 2 other principles of painting to consider. I'll mention these very quickly. The first one being texture. So essentially we're considering the surface quality of the paint. So is it thick, thin, matte, gloss, textured, flat? You go on and on with all of the different options and how we create texture. And in many ways, this is much more applicable to, say, oils and acrylics. However, there are many ways to create different textures in watercolour, or at least we can create the illusion of texture on what is effectively a relatively flat surface, especially compared to those other mediums. But we've got things on our side as watercolourists like granulation and salt and splattering and cling film and throwing the paint around, all of these different things that we can do. There are plenty of options to vary the look of watercolour and to mix things up a little bit. Essentially, I think of them as kind of special effects, but they should be decorations and individuality kind of sprinkled on top of the other 5 principles. Then finally, we have the story of the painting. So why are we painting it? What drew us to the subject? What are we trying to say as the artist? This doesn't have to be super deep and meaningful, although it can be, of course, but the story could be very literal, like, what's the story of the one figure on the beach? Where's that person going? Who is the person in the portrait? What are those birds or animals doing? But also the story can simply be, here is a painting of a beautiful landscape, or isn't the light and the atmosphere fascinating in this scene? The point, I think, is to give consideration and time to what it is that attracted you to the subject and what you want to achieve with your painting. And this is great because it can really keep us on track with a painting, and it can help us when we get stuck. This is all stuff I'm going to talk about more in future videos, how we implement this stuff. But that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed that and you found it useful. As I said, this is kind of laying the groundwork for lots more videos to come on how to use these principles and how to bring them into all aspects of your painting. Look out for part 2 of this video, where I take 2 of my own paintings and I talk about all of these principles in action, and I analyze my own painting throughout and at the end and at the beginning. Please do consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to see all of these future videos. Feel free to share this with other people you think may enjoy it. As I said at the start, I have started doing regular Zoom demos and courses, so please do check the links in the description if you're interested in those. And don't forget, I do have a Patreon teaching channel where I share a lot more of my actual paintings in the form of long length videos, mini and large tutorials, lots of narrated time lapses, and loads more kind of quick tips and live streams and a Facebook group, all of that sort of stuff. Links in the description. That's all of my plugs. Until next time, guys, happy creating, happy painting, and I will catch you in the next episode.